Okay, so over the years I've stumbled upon some very important existential paradoxes that are, in my opinion, unsolvable. At least unsolvable for the very fabric of thinking itself. Like the fact that we can question and think about the nature of reality will always lead us towards unsolvable paradoxes of thinking itself. But I'm asking you for some help. Maybe you know about these paradoxes, and maybe they have been already debunked for ages. I don't know. I consider myself as an amateur philosopher, and to be honest, I'm not really book smart. I'm not an academic. So if you have any knowledge about these paradoxes, or you know how these paradoxes are conceptualized and explained in academic philosophy or in any other field, please let me know. Now, without further ado, here are the paradoxes. It's a mixture of religious, scientific, and philosophy-based perspectives. Number one, God is beyond reason and comprehension. Now, the statement, God is beyond reason and comprehension, is an explanation that was produced by reason and comprehension itself. And this statement contradicts itself because, from its point of view, God is reasonable by being beyond reason. The statement beyond reason is a reasonable statement based on our reason. So, if we apply the statement beyond reason to God, then he is by definition reasonable. He is reasonable in the sense that he is beyond reason, which is a contradiction and cannot be used as an argument to define God. The second paradox, God is indefinable. Well, this is the same kind of contradiction, but with a different word. So if God is indefinable, does this statement define God? Again, it's a contradiction in the sense that we define God as being indefinable. So this is another flawed argument that cannot be used to define God. To say that God is indefinable cannot be used to define God. The third paradox. One theory of everything can explain all of reality. Okay, so the problem here is that it begs the question: what is the nature of this theory of everything? What's the nature of it? Is it a product of reality, or is it something beyond reality? If it is a product of reality, then it must also be able to explain itself, because if it can explain all of reality, and since the theory itself is also a part of reality, then it must be able to explain itself as well. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to explain all of reality. But it's impossible to explain itself because it can only integrate and explain information outside of itself. It can only process information outside of itself. I really don't know how it would be possible to process itself into itself. That's like trying to consume and process your whole body with your own mouth. And that's impossible. That's a self-referential paradox. Now, on the other hand, if a theory of everything is something beyond reality, we end up with the same classical contradiction as the statement God is beyond reality. The statement God is beyond reality is produced within reality, so that's a contradiction. The fourth paradox. Reality is a priori consciousness. In other words, the universe existed before us. So, we assume that the universe existed before we became aware of it and before we could think about it. Now that does seem to make a lot of sense initially, but consider this logical process. So 1. The universe existed a priori consciousness / thinking. So the universe existed as a thoughtless thing by itself because nobody existed to have thoughts about it. 2. Then we came into existence and became aware of it and we could think about it. 3. And then we came to the conclusion that the universe existed before we came into existence and before we were able to have thoughts about it. But the problem is that we can't define a thoughtless universe with thoughts. You see, to claim that the universe existed before we could think about it is itself a statement produced by thinking, and it is trying to describe something outside of thinking, something beyond thinking, something before thinking was possible. And that's a real logical contradiction, to define something that doesn't contain thinking with thinking. You see? And here's the last paradox. The reality that we perceive exists by itself as an external thing, independent from the brain, from consciousness. Now this boils down to the exact same paradox as the fourth one. So again, within our brains and through thinking, we are trying to define a world outside of the brain and outside of thinking. But it doesn't matter how we define it, because every possible definition that we give to it is automatically produced within the brain and through thinking. The brain can simply never define what lies outside of itself, because that's always a paradox. Everything that the brain defines is created from within the brain, and it can't go outside of itself and give a definition outside of itself. See, this is a very important paradox that should be understood. And I don't believe personally that it is possible to break through these paradoxes through thinking. But I am always open to what you might have to say about this.